What's up, guys? This is the Theology Brothers podcast. This is a continuation. This is part two of the discussion that we began in the previous episode on biblical marriage, biblical divorce, and seeing what the Bible has to say about the central question: can someone who has been divorced serve in ministry positions or serve in pastoral ministry? And in the previous episode, we discussed how the Bible in First Timothy chapter 3 talks about the qualifications of pastoral ministry and pastor teachers or ministry leaders or elders. And in those qualifications, it talks about how individuals should be man of one wife. That's the ESV's rendering of that particular verse. And traditionally in the Protestant church, we talked about this a little bit in the last episode as well. Traditionally in the Protestant church, this has been interpreted as essentially an individual who has been married only once, or someone who has been married and never been remarried. And in the previous episode, we talked about how this was likely an inaccurate version or an accurate rendering or an inaccurate interpretation of that particular phrase, because the Greek word that is used by Paul literally means married to one person at a time. And if he had desired to use the word in the Greek, married only once, he would have done so and could have done so, because the rendering or that word is used in a variety of other instances in extra biblical literature or in Greek writings at the time. So in other words, it wasn't as if that type of writing or that type of literature would have been unknown to Paul. He could have used that terminology and could have used that word if he desired to express that central thought. He chose not to, and he wrote that you should be married to one person at a time. And I talked about how it was likely a discouragement from multiple wives at once. This term polygamy, kind of rears its ugly head once again, and because it was something that was prevalent in Jewish culture prior to the time of Christ, or I should really say prior to the time of the Roman occupation or the Roman seizure of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people at the time was still practicing this, although it wasn't something that was as prevalent as before the Roman occupation or the leadership of Rome of the Jewish people at the time. So I talked about that a little bit, and I also talked about what the divine design for marriage looked like. The divine design I talked about in the last episode was that marriage should be between man and woman, and it should be a lifetime commitment. That the divine design for marriage was that divorce was not an option. Divorce should never occur. Divorce should not occur. And that the divine design for marriage is for the man to love their wife as Christ loves the church, and for the women and the wives to love their husband as the church loves Christ. That was the divine design, and that echoes Ephesians chapter 5 when Paul writes to the church at Ephesus and talks about that specific instance. And so I said at the end of the last episode that we're going to be answering a lot of different central questions, and we're going to do that pretty quickly as we get into this episode. But those questions are not all inclusive questions, but I'm going to go ahead and say them again. Does this mean that divorce is a sin? So all the things that we talked about in the first episode, does that mean that I'm essentially making a case? And in other words, does that mean that I believe that the Bible makes a case that divorce is a sin? In most cases, yes. But to put it more plainly and to put it or to communicate it essentially a little bit better, in most cases, I believe the Bible points to the fact that divorce is centered around some type of sin. That sin is what leads to a divorce. What I'm not saying is that if you file for divorce in every circumstance, that you are sinning or that you are committing sin. So I want to be very clear. But what I am saying is that every divorce has sin at its root. Every divorce is rooted with some form of sin. I'm not saying that if you file for divorce that you are committing a sin yourself. I want to be clear there. So we also want to answer the question, are there any divorces that are permissible in the eyes of God? I'm going to make a case that yes, there are some instances in which divorces are permissible in the eyes of God. Jesus refers to what those instances are. Paul refers to what those instances are. We'll look at those in detail. Are there ever any divorces in which it pleases God for them to take place? I'm going to make a case that no, there are never any circumstances or never any types of divorces in which God is pleased that they occur. Because again, it goes back to what I just said. Every type of divorce is centered around some form of sin. Therefore, God is not pleased that they occur because he is not pleased that there is sin that is a central crux of that marriage at that moment and at that time. So I don't believe that God is ever pleased for divorce to take place, but I do believe that there are divorces in which he permits. Is there ever a scenario or scenarios in which it would be permissible for pastors or church leaders to suffer divorce? I'm going to make a case that yes, the answer to that is yes, it is. There are circumstances in which it is permissible for pastors to suffer divorce. And would it be permissible at times for my church or ministry to consider a pastor or ministry leader who has been divorced in the past? I'm going to make a case that the answer to that is yes in the following points of this podcast. And as a ministry leader who has been divorced in the past, is it permissible for you to seek out other ministry opportunities? I'm going to make a case that yes, it is permissible and even appropriate for you to do so. If I have been divorced, can God still use me in ministry? Or if I have been divorced, can I still be used by God as a pastor in pastoral ministry? And again, I'm going to make a case in the next few minutes or so that the answer to that question is yes. And so now as we move ahead in this podcast, I want us to look a little bit more closely at the latter verses, the other three verses of Matthew chapter 19 that refer to divorce that we did not look at previously. In the previous episode, we looked at Matthew 19, verses 3 through 6. And today I want us to look at Matthew 19, 7 through 9. So Jesus is speaking here, and I'm again reading in the ESV. They said to him, why then, and this is the Pharisees speaking to Jesus, right? We set the stage last episode, we set the stage to say that the Pharisees had tried to bait him and try to get him to essentially, fumble his words to the extent that he would be caught in either a teaching that would go against the law of Moses, so they would have him and they would be able to imprison him, or something that would go against the Roman law, and they could use it against him with Herod. So the Pharisees are talking here. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? He said to them, that's Jesus, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So now we come to the main thrust of the text, and the real answer behind divorce is given by Jesus to the Pharisees who aimed at tricking him. The Pharisees essentially hear the words of Jesus and know that he has successfully rebutted their entire attempt, and that's why they leave following the words of Jesus in this text. But in an effort to get Jesus to directly implicate himself in these verses that we just read, they ask him a specific question on the passage from Genesis. It's actually Deuteronomy 24:1 there. I misquote. The law allowed for men in Jewish culture to provide a certificate of divorce to his wife and to send her away. The law essentially says to Jewish men that all you need to do in order to divorce your wife is to provide her a piece of paper, a certificate of divorce, and say, I have found something clean in you. And of course, that is ambiguous. It's left to the interpreter. I have found something unclean in you, and so therefore I'm going to send you away. I'm going to go ahead and divorce you. Thinking they have trapped him successfully, the Pharisees undoubtedly do not expect the way that Jesus responds here. He responds by communicating that this allowance in the law of Moses allowing people to provide a certificate of divorce and thus divorcing their wife, was provided by God as a means of grace due to the hardness of heart of the people. In other words, God provided an avenue of reconciliation for his people due to the effects of sin in the world. That doesn't mean, as Jesus makes clear at the end of verse 8, that this was the intention of God from the start. As noted previously, the intention of God for marriage is that it is a lifelong commitment to one another. However, sin obviously works in the world through various means, and we see here that it has indeed affected God's design for marriage, just as it did for God's design of creation when Adam sinned and placed humanity outside the garden, creating a new order of relationship with God. As stated previously, the Jewish people and certainly religious leaders of the time had abused this concession in the Mosaic law to the extent that Jewish men routinely participated in polygamy prior to Roman rule, primarily, it's like I've already talked about, and treated their wives as commodities that could be traded at leisure. They essentially just treated their wives as things that could be traded, as like anything else. So with this backdrop in mind, in verse number 9, Jesus provides his primary concession in which divorce is permissible. Now, this passage in question mirrors mostly what is said in Luke 16:18, which is just a one-verse excerpt. Luke does not provide much in terms of details because it is provided in detail in Matthew and in Mark, which was written prior to Luke, except that it does provide in Matthew the concession in which divorce is permissible. That's the only difference here. And this is consistent with Matthew's other writings in Matthew 5:32 and his assertion in Matthew chapter 1 that Joseph was right in seeking divorce for Mary at the conception of Jesus. Now, if you remember, what am I talking about there? Well, Matthew says that Joseph is right in seeking concession from or seeking divorce from Mary because of her perceived sexual immorality, right? She was immaculately conceived, right? Immaculate conception. She had a child inside of her, and the logical conclusion was that she must have had or participated in sexual immorality. So therefore, Matthew says that Joseph was right in seeking that divorce when Mary was conceived with Jesus. So what do the words of Jesus state in our text today? Well, in verse 9, Jesus states that if anyone divorces their wife except for sexual immorality and marries another, they commit adultery. So in other words, it is clear that Jesus is stating that divorce is not acceptable for anyone except in the case of sexual immorality. This is consistent with his previous teachings on love and reconciliation in the sense that his view of divorce places the wife or the woman in the situation at an elevated and treasured place in the life of the man. That was something that was not prevalent in Jewish culture at the time that Jesus lived. In other words, it restores the woman back to her rightful place with the man, not as one to easily be traded or discarded, as was common during the time, but loved, respected, valued, and treasured. This would have been shocking to not only the Pharisees, but was also apparently shocking to the disciples who heard him. If we were to continue on reading in verses 10 through 12, we would see this. The disciples viewed a lifelong commitment of marriage with no way of separation other than sexual immorality as intrinsically unrealistic, even saying that it is better not to marry than to be part of that type of arrangement. And so, in other words, the primary point of Jesus here is that women are God's creation and should be valued and treasured. And the original plan of God in marriage should be the primary aim. So, the key then in understanding divorce from a biblical point of view hinges on what is meant by Jesus when he says sexual immorality, or how our versions translated into sexual immorality. And as I already have said, it has been widely accepted throughout Protestant churches throughout history that what is meant as a condition for divorce here is adultery. And this would make Jesus' teaching, in effect, whoever divorces his wife except for adultery and marries another commits adultery. That would be the teaching here. If we were to accept that what Jesus means by sexual immorality here is adultery, then what he's actually teaching is that whoever divorces his wife except for the case of adultery and you marry another, you commit adultery. And so there are a couple of issues, I think, with this interpretation. First, if that was the intention of Christ, why didn't he use the word for adultery in the original language? In Greek, the word that is translated to sexual immorality in most translations, the ESV, the NIV, the New American Standard, etc., the ones who take the text more literally, or in the King James Version, it's rendered fornication. That's the word that you have there in those translations. In the Greek, that word is pronounced porneia. It literally means sexual acts that are morally objectable. In Greek, the word that is translated adultery in verse 9 and used in other places throughout the New Testament to mean the same is not the same word. The word that is used, it refers to the physical act with someone other than their spouse. So if Jesus was referring to the physical act of adultery as a reason for permissible divorce here, it seems reasonable that he would have said that the physical act of adultery is the reason. So in other words, if he was referring to the physical act of adultery as the reason for permissible divorce, it seems like he would have just simply said that, as he used that term just a few words later in other places during his ministry. So it's not like he just uses the word once here in Matthew 19. He uses it in other places throughout the Gospels as he is speaking. So it's not as if he didn't know the word. However, the word that he uses here in the original language has the implication of different types of acts that are morally objectable. This word is used throughout the New Testament to describe various types of sexual sins. It's not just used here, it's used throughout the New Testament. Paul uses it quite a bit in the book of Romans to describe the variety of sexual immoral acts that constitute a depraved and degenerate generation. The implication? It is not just the single act of adultery that could be means of permissible divorce. It is any act that produces the type of hurt and death in a marriage that adultery would also produce. In other words, in 2025, this term could be more inclusive than only referring to the act of cheating on your spouse. It could also be used to describe the habitual and unrepentant view of viewing pornography, or the unrepentant, consistent attending of strip clubs, or sexual conversations with people other than your spouse, including emotional cheating. It could also mean abuse, particularly physical abuse or sexual abuse by a spouse. Now, these will be expounded upon later in the next point that I'm going to make in this teaching. But for now, it should be said that Jesus is communicating that if the effects of sin infiltrate the marriage through cheating of any form, physical or sexual abuse, addiction of any kind, an unrepentance of addiction to pornography, open and unrepentant strip club attendance, or anything remotely similar, then it is permissible in those instances for divorce to occur. The word used for divorce has the implication of being freed. In other words, once divorce has been permitted, the non-offensive party is not enslaved due to the sin of the other. This will be expounded upon in the next point as Paul makes this a bit clearer to us in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is the primary refutal argument from authors and pastors that concede that divorce is permissible, but that remarriage is not afforded by the Bible. As I've already made allusions to, my favorite pastor, John Piper, is among those who hold to this type of view that divorce is okay, but remarriage is not permissible. But that view would necessitate one to accept the fact that if you have a divorce, then the non-offensive party, the non-sinning party, is continually enslaved by the sinning party. That type of teaching is not consistent with the teaching of love and reconciliation taught by Christ throughout his earthly ministry. Again, to believe this, what my favorite pastor John Piper believes, that divorce is okay, but remarriage is not, to believe this would be to minimize the primary aim of Christ's teachings up to this point. Again, Jesus had primarily spoken about reconciliation and new life through him to those who believe. It would not make any contextual sense for him to now say that all of that is true unless you have the unfortunate experience of being married to someone who has been overtaken by sin and refuses to turn away or to see a reason. In other words, it wouldn't make any type of contextual sense for Jesus to say that new life and new birth is available to you if you are the sinning party. But if you are not the sinning party in a marriage, you are continually enslaved and new life to you is not available. It would make no sense. That's not a just and a righteous act. So consistent with Jesus' teaching, this passage that we have just talked about seems to make clear that if divorce occurs due to a spouse being overtaken by sexual sin, the spouse that did not sin is freed and not enslaved to the one who sinned. And this, again, will also be seen clearer in chapter 7, when Paul speaks to widows and then provides the freedom to marry whomever they wish, which, by the way, would have been a change from Mosaic law, in that widows no longer were forced to marry the brother of their husband, up to the point of Paul saying what he says about widows in 1 Corinthians 7. It was standard practice that if you have a widow, they were forced, they needed to marry the brother of their husband. Obviously, the idea was to take care of the widow. But what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is that if you are a widow, you are freed. You are no longer enslaved. You are not a slave to your former husband or to their family. You are freed to marry whomever you wish and be taken care of in whatever way you see fit. So the Bible is consistent in its teaching throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament. The Bible is a consistent teaching that Christ is at the center of it all. And his message of redemption is at the center and the crux of all that the Bible talks about. Likewise, the Bible is consistent in its teaching, and to teach that remarriage is not permitted following divorce would not take a consistent and holistic approach to biblical interpretation. So we've talked about the passage in the book of Matthew in which Jesus talks about instances in which marriage is permissible. And I have just tried to make a case that Jesus is not speaking only about adultery in that particular passage, but he is speaking about the action of sexual immorality, which can be inclusive of a variety of different things. And so let's move our attention to what Paul says about this issue in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And we're going to look at the majority of what he writes here in the first 16 verses of the chapter. Paul says this, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. Now, let me stop right there and answer this question, because you may be listening to this and asking yourself, well, how was Paul? Well, he's talking about singleness here. Paul was not married. He was a single man. He is saying that I wish that all were as I am myself. I wish that all were single. To the unmarried and the widows, Paul's speaking here, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. Now, I want you to notice here Paul's wording. He says, to the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. In other words, he is going to quote the Bible. He is going to quote the Lord. He is going to quote God. And he is, everything that he says following that is an example of the divine intention of marriage. Everything that we talked about previously in this teaching up to this point, the divine teaching of marriage in Genesis chapter 2 and Deuteronomy 24, he talks about this, and that's what he has on his mind. To the rest, I say, I, not the Lord. Now, he puts that in there, and I want to stop here and say, because one objection could be that everything he says in this section is not from God, so therefore shouldn't be taken with as much weight. But just because he says I, not the Lord, does not take away the divine inspiration that follows. Everything that is in the writings of Paul, as believers and as Christians, we believe was divinely inspired. So just because he says I, not the Lord, does not negate his divine inspiration in writing the words that follow. All he's saying here is that he is not quoting from the biblical text. He is not quoting from the Mosaic law. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? And so in this passage of scripture, Paul provides another instance in which divorce is permissible. I hope you caught that. Maybe you caught that, maybe you did not. But in verse 12, Paul states, I, not the Lord. And I've already talked about this a little bit, but I want to drive this home. Verse 12, Paul says, I, not the Lord, meaning that he is not directly quoting Jesus or God from the Old Testament as he did in verse 10. In verse 10, he quotes directly what Jesus says. And if you remember, Jesus quotes from the book of Genesis. And Paul does the same thing in Ephesians chapter 5. but it is not in any way to detract from his divinely inspired authorship. Now, I think I've made that point. I've said that several times. I hope I've made that point. So what does Paul say regarding divorce? Well, he makes it abundantly clear that reconciliation should be the primary aim of all couples. In other words, every effort should be made in ensuring that the marriage can be salvaged. Or to put it another way, every effort should be made in ensuring that marriage cannot be salvaged before divorce is even thought about as a possibility. So if you are a believer and you're listening to this and you're going through marriage difficulties or things are just simply difficult in your relationship, my encouragement to you is do everything possible to make sure or to try to ensure that you can save your marriage. That is the divine will of God, that your marriage lasts a lifetime. What does that look like practically? It means that if you're a husband, put your wife first. And if you're a wife, put your husband first. Again, this imagery, I love it. I've said it multiple times throughout this teaching, but I love it. I believe that it is the greatest image that we have of a biblical marriage. Husbands, love your wife like Jesus loved the church. How much did he love the church? Brothers and sisters, he died for the church. He gave himself up for the church. And for wives, love your husbands as Christ loved the church. How much does the church love Christ? Well, they give up their lives for Christ. That's what they're called to do. So the encouragement here is, guys, that if you're in a marriage relationship and it's not going well, there are difficulties all around, and you are divorce has come into your mind, I want you to just simply take that away. And for a moment or for a month, as long as you can do it, make sure that you're putting your wife first, or make sure that you're putting your husband first, and that you are willing to give up your own preferences for their benefit. That's what unconditional love is all about. So the instance that Paul states divorce is permissible, well, it's abandonment. It's desertion. He speaks within the context of an unbeliever who abandons their believing spouse. He basically assumes that believing spouses would not abandon their spouse. He basically assumes that. It should be said here that in the event that a spouse simply leaves, it is very likely that they are not believers, regardless of their various professions. So regardless of what they say, if they simply leave, no explanation given, or you come home one day and they're no longer there, they're probably not believers. And to do so, because in order for them to do this, to do so would be to abandon what God has called them to do, and would demonstrate to the world that they are doing this. Again, a marriage is something that is visible to the world. So for them to simply leave will be to abandon what God has called them to do and to live the life that God has called them to. And it would show the world that they are willing to abandon it. So it's not just a personal thing at that point. It's showing the world that they're going to abandon what God has called them to do. So regardless, we want to focus. So I hope I've made that case abundantly clear. So now I want to focus on what is Paul's instruction to the spouse that is left. Well, Paul says, in such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. The word in the Greek that is used for enslaved here literally translates to being their slave. In other words, Paul is making it clear that if a spouse leaves, the spouse that is left, the unoffending spouse, is no longer bound to that person, and they are free to let them go, and they are free to move on with their life. Another key component to this passage is the phrase that Paul uses in verse 15 that is translated to be in such cases. And this is going to unlock, when we look at this, I hope it's going to unlock a variety of different keys or locks for you in this entire conversation. Now, Dr. Wayne Grudem makes a great point about Paul's use of this phrase in his book, What the Bible Says About Divorce and Remarriage. This is the book here. I do encourage you to read it. It's very easy to get through. There's only 90 or so pages in the book. So please, I encourage you to read that. Dr. Grudem puts it like this: the Greek phrase that is translated as "in such cases" is "in toitis." The phrase does not occur anywhere else in the New Testament, nor does it occur in the Septuagint, which is the Greek or the Latin translation of the Greek. It does occur in Greek literature outside of the Bible, but so far as I can tell, no interpreter of 1 Corinthians has ever studied its use in extra biblical literature. Most commentators just simply assume that it means in cases of desertion by an unbeliever, which is the specific situation that Paul mentions. However, and this is Dr. Grudem, I found several examples where this Greek phrase clearly referred to more types of situations than the specific situation than the author was discussing. So Dr. Grudem mentions the word of Phileo, which is a Jewish author, Lysis, a Greek orator, and Euphrodite. I'm so sorry, I'm butchering that name, but he's a Greek author as well. Once he lists these examples, Dr. Grudem then states that it should be clear from those examples that when Paul uses that Greek word to say, in such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved, he implies that divorce is a legitimate possibility, not only in the case of desertion by an unbeliever, but also in other circumstances that are similar to, but not necessarily like, desertion. A reasonable possibility is that in such cases means in this and other similarly destructive situations. That is, situations that destroy a marriage as much as adultery or desertion. A confirming argument comes from Paul's use of the plural expression in such cases, where he could have just used the singular expression in this case. That's the Greek word in totu, if he had wanted to refer only to the case of desertion by an unbeliever. So in other words, Paul uses plural terminology. He could have used the singular terminology if he just simply meant the instance that he is referring to, but he doesn't do that. Paul chooses to use a plural version of that Greek noun, and in so doing, the translation that we have in English becomes "in such cases" as opposed to "in this case." He uses that same singular phrase. And so it's not as if he doesn't know what the word is, right? Because he uses that singular phrase in 1 Corinthians 11:22 and in 2 Corinthians 8:18. You can go look those up, but those are the other two instances in which that Greek terminology is used in the singular sense. So Paul uses that later on in this book, if you're paying attention. So I find this to be a convincing argument. Placing within the context of all that we have discussed, it is clear with this basis as interpretation that this is indeed what Paul was intended or has intended to be understood by the original audience. It also aligns and is consistent with the message of Christ throughout his earthly ministry and provides hope to people in otherwise hopeless circumstances. This view of this text and the words of Jesus also provide key indicators on the implication for those desiring to serve in leadership positions of pastoral ministry. And we're going to talk about that in the closing point, in the next point. But let us close this teaching by looking at clear implications of what we've talked about as seen through the Bible. And we will also use the work of Dr. Grudem to help define the totality of situations in which divorce may be appropriate. So in this final point, I want to talk about all that we have discussed. I want to drive the points home of what the implications are. I want to be very clear as to what the implications are, because we've said a lot of stuff. We've said a lot of kind of in-depth looking and studying at the Greek text, but it matters none if we can't make the points of how we are implicated as a result, as believers. How does it apply to my life, and how does it apply to your life, those of you who are watching or listening? So the implication is other different forms or other types of situations in which divorce is the only remedy. The following list, I'm going to give you a list, but the following list comes from Dr. Wayne Grudem in the book that I referenced. So one instance of appropriate divorce would be in the instance of abuse. If abuse, and this is a quote from Dr. Grudem, if an abused spouse is forced to flee from the home for self-protection from ongoing violent abuse, in my judgment, that would be a situation in which the damage is sufficiently similar to the damage from adultery or desertion that divorce would be a legitimate option. Abuse is actively violent, and thus worse in many ways to outright desertion. Additionally, the abusing spouse has not technically deserted, but he or she bears the moral guilt of causing the separation. So let me be very clear at this point. I am not saying that divorce is legitimate in every case in which a spouse claims to be abused. But I am saying that there are some cases in which the abuse has damaged the marriage as much as adultery or desertion would damage it. And in such cases, in the context of 1 Corinthians 7:15, this would apply and divorce would be legitimate. In some cases, even a single instance of abuse may be so violent that it would be dangerous for the abused spouse to return. And in such a situation, it would be legitimate for that spouse to seek divorce. So abuse would be an appropriate scenario in which divorce is appropriate, which this is a diversion from a lot of pastors or teachers, particularly within the denomination that Patrick and I come from, the Southern Baptist Convention. And if you remember, not that long ago, just a couple of years, the Southern Baptist Convention had a massive scandal regarding sexual abuse and abuse of church members. And one of the main thruxes of the reason why it occurred was spouses. Obviously, pastors were sexually abusing women, but in other cases, there were spouses that were sexually abusing their wife. And the wives in those cases were told by their pastors that you are not able to divorce them and to maintain a Christian life. And this is something that I pray never happens again. Because in cases in which abuse is taking place, the marriage is irrevocably harmed, just as it would be if adultery occurs or outright desertion occurred. So therefore, divorce is appropriate. Not only abuse of a spouse, but abuse of children. If abuse of children is taking place, whether that is physical or sexual, then it is appropriate for the unsinning spouse to seek divorce, because irrevocable damage to the child and to the family, and thus to the spouse, has been perpetrated by a sinning spouse. And again, like I talked about in the introduction and like I talked about throughout this teaching, sin is at the central of all divorces. Doesn't mean that there is sin on both parts of the marriage that caused the divorce. And in this case, sin of the abusing spouse is going to be what causes the divorce. Therefore, the unsinning spouse should not feel confined or restricted or enslaved to that other spouse, and therefore should be free to not only divorce, but to remarry as well. So abuse of children should be appropriate in order to seek a divorce. Also, extreme and prolonged verbal and relational cruelty. Right, Dr. Grudem puts that point like this: a treatment that is destroying the other spouse's mental and emotional stability could be so severe that it would fall into the category of in such cases and would be a legitimate ground for divorce. So in other words, extreme or prolonged verbal and relational cruelty could rise to the level that it is just as harmful as if this other spouse was not there, or it would be just as harmful as if the other spouse cheated on that person. And in those cases, that it would be a legitimate grounds for divorce. The next one is credible threats of serious physical harm or murder. If a spouse is threatening to hurt you, if a spouse is threatening to kill you, If a spouse is threatening to harm you with a weapon, and you have to take a weapon away from the spouse, as was my case in my marriage, in those cases, they could rise to the level in which they would be just as detrimental and just as harmful as if the spouse deserted or committed adultery, and therefore would be a legitimate grounds for divorce. An irreconcilable or an unrepentant addiction to drugs or alcohol could also be another grounds for legitimate divorce. Someone who is addicted to drugs and alcohol oftentimes undertakes a multitude of lies and deceptions in order to accomplish and to appease their addiction. And in so doing, creates irreparable harm to a marriage and covenant union and defiles God's design, God's divine design for what marriage is supposed to look like and supposed to be. So therefore, drug and alcohol addiction could be a cause or a reason for legitimate divorce. Not only drug and alcohol addiction, but gambling addiction could also be something that could be a legitimate cause for divorce, because just like with drug and alcohol addiction, gambling addiction does involve lies and deception in order to appease its addiction, in order to appease itself. And oftentimes in gambling addiction, just like drug and alcohol addiction, it involves finances. And so there are different things that could be seen and done in those types of instances that would cause irreparable harm to a marriage. So therefore, it leads us to conclude that they could be grounds for divorce. And the last one here, so we've talked about two things with addiction: drug and alcohol addiction and gambling addiction. The last one is probably the more common one, but it is in fact an addiction that occurs with many people, man and woman, male and female. And that's addiction, unrepentant addiction to pornography. And as I said previously, when we were discussing Matthew chapter 19, I do believe that pornography can be clumped together in what Jesus was referring to when he said sexual immorality, because the Greek word that is used is the Greek word porneia, that can mean a variety or a multitude of sexual sins, not just the singular action of cheating on your spouse, but anything that is similar to it in nature. And certainly getting your gratification from a computer screen or from other people. And in 2025, there's all types of avenues in which to accomplish this. And of course, you can form even internet relationships with people through things like OnlyFans and other types of websites that do go past just the physical and go into the emotional. And so it's just as bad and can be just as irreparable or just as harmful as cheating on your spouse, but you're never leaving your house. And so that could also be grounds for legitimate divorce, because it causes a similar type of scenario that Jesus and Paul were referring to. So this brings us to the primary question of this teaching. Can pastors or leaders be divorced? And I want to be very transparent as to why that's the central question that I'm answering in this teaching, because that is my situation. That is something that I've studied for a variety of years since I got divorced in 2020. It's now 2025. I was absolutely angry when my divorce occurred, because it occurred outside of my control. And some of you know details. Some of you who are going to listen to this and watch this do not know details, but I am the one who filed for divorce. So if you know that and you hear that, it's difficult, I think, to rationalize how was it outside of my control. And I'll give you a few details here. And it's difficult for me to even talk about, but I think it's relevant, because an obvious objection to all that I've talked about up to this point, and an obvious question up to this point is, well, Forrest, aren't you just making a case to excuse yourself? And that there may be blind spots in my life. I'm admitting that. But what I've tried to do in this teaching and in my study in preparation for this teaching and in my study throughout the Bible, in my own walk, is to try to be faithful to see what the Bible truly says. And if the Bible truly said something that was contrary to what I have taught here, I would have said that. I believe that. I believe that I would have brought that out, because my prayer is to be faithful to the text, period. Regardless of what that is, whether that's a condemnation on me, because I know I'm sinful. I know I am. I know I have made mistakes, and I know I continue to make mistakes. If that had been prevalent in the teaching, then I would have taken this teaching in a completely different direction. But what I have seen in the text here today or in 2025 is what I have taught up to this point. And so for me personally, in my divorce, there were a variety of things that occurred that caused my divorce. It wasn't one thing. It wasn't just one big thing. It was a variety of things. So for me, whenever I was going through divorce, I was contemplating, obviously, whether or not I would be able to be a pastor again. And my ex-wife at the time even used that against me. She said that I would never file for divorce from her, so she could do whatever she wished. I would never file for divorce because I was called to be a pastor or a ministry leader or a teacher, and that if I did that, I would never do it again. I would never be permitted to do it again. And I believe that because of my upbringing, and I believe that because of what many teachers that I respect and what they teach. And so I got angry. In my marriage, I got married very, very quickly, and I got married as quickly as I did because primarily because I was encouraged to do so by a pastor mentor at the time. I was an associate pastor, and I did not. The mistake that I made was early on. I did not get to know my ex-wife the way that I should have prior to marriage. I thought I knew her, and I was stubborn. I was young. I was in my young 20s. I was 24. And I thought it was sufficient. I thought I knew her well enough, but I'm telling you, I did not. And I was obviously a pastor at the time, and she was a Christian by all accounts. It appeared that she was a Christian. And things were okay. Things were pretty good for the first year or so. And in that year, I had taken a role as a senior pastor in my hometown, and I was enjoying ministry. I was doing what I believe God had truly called me to do. However, she was absolutely miserable. And one day I got home, and we had an argument and disagreement on the fact that she no longer wanted to be a pastor's wife. She didn't want it. She had stopped going to church at that point. She hadn't gone to church in about 2 or 3 weeks. And she just confronted me and told me, I don't want to be a pastor's wife anymore. And I'm going to go home. I'm going to leave. That's what she told me. And I said, okay, like, I don't think that should happen. And of course, I fought for my marriage. And I told her, we really just need to pray about this. We really just need to seek God, because I feel as if we're doing what God has called us to do and led us here to do. But she just simply could not be away from her family. And so one day I went to work, and when I got back, she was in fact gone. She was gone. And I called her and pleaded with her, begged her to come back. And she refused. She said that if I wanted to save the marriage, she was open to saving the marriage. But if I wanted to save the marriage, that I would have to leave the church, and I'd have to move in with her family. And we had only been married for about 1.5 years at that point. And I strongly believed that I wanted to make sure that my family was more important to me than any ministry or any position. And so therefore I did leave the church and I tried to reconcile my marriage. It didn't really work. I did take on another job in public transportation. That's how I got involved in public transportation. Started a job in public transit, and I tried to just simply preach as opportunities arose, fill in stuff here and there, in interim roles like that. And it didn't necessarily work for me, but you know, like it wasn't working living with her family. The family was we were not able to be our own family. So I got an opportunity to go to Knoxville, Tennessee to work at the transit system there. And so we did eventually move there. And when we got there, she said, "I'm going to try to make this work." I said, "Okay." And we did try to make it work there. And she was there consistently for about 6 months. And then she started taking long extended breaks back to her home with her mom and with her dad. And eventually, by 2019, she would go to her home for 6 months or so and come back to Tennessee for about a month and go back home for 3, 4, 5 months. And I told her, like, this isn't working. Like, this isn't going to work like this. We can't be a family. We can't grow together. We can't be husband and wife. Like, I left ministry for you. I left ministry to try to be who I needed to be as a husband. And at this point, she revealed that she was addicted to pornography. She had had an emotional affair with our next door neighbor who was a female. And I did catch them together once. And it was a very difficult scenario for me to not only grapple with all that we had been through, but then to see that she was kissing this girl who she had just tried to be friends with, I thought. When COVID started in 2020, she decided to leave and go back to her home because I was still having to work. I was still having to go into work each day, regardless of whether or not the pandemic was happening or not. I still had to go into work. I was driving a bus at the time. And when I got home one day, she had gone. She had left and gone to her home because she didn't want to be around the virus or COVID. And when I learned that, when I saw that, I did text her and say to her, just don't come back. You can stay where you're at. Just don't come back. I'm okay. And it wasn't long after that I did file for divorce. Of course, she was saying through text, and she was saying, I tried to call her once, but she was saying primarily through text that I'll never file for divorce from her because of the fact that I always still wanted to go back to ministry. And unfortunately, it did come to the point where I believed that the marriage was irreconcilable. There was nothing that I could do to save the marriage because I had done all of that for the last 5.5 years, and it was never going to change. She would never change, and there was some hurts there that would have been difficult for me to get past. So I filed for divorce, and our marriage ended. And so since then, I have been pressed with this question: can someone who is in ministry be divorced? And for a long time, I believed that the answer to that question was no. And I believed that when I filed for divorce. I believed that. And I said and I prayed to God that, I hope, I prayed that there is a way that I can be used, but I cannot do this. I can't experience this hurt any longer. I can't do this anymore. And so as I went through the next couple of years or so, I was mad. I was angry at God even, and I was angry at those particular people. But slowly but surely, God began to bring me back to himself. Eventually, I felt God leading me to Virginia in the late 2022. And it was there that I met my now eventual wife. She worked there, and it was largely through her that God called me back to himself, essentially saying that, he hasn't changed. His love hasn't changed. His message of reconciliation hasn't changed. And I repented of my hardness of heart and turned back to him. And that is where I am at currently in my life. And so I say all of that to say that we've come, like the reason why that I have come to this place where I believe what I have taught is not because of my past. I see that in the Bible. And of course, the works of Dr. Grudem has helped as well. But, there may be blind spots because of my previous experience. But I've tried to rid my blind spots. I try to get rid of my blind spots because I know that they may exist because of my past. Nonetheless, that brings us to the primary question of this teaching. Can pastors or leaders be divorced? And we've already answered this question for the most part. The qualifications of an individual for church office found in 1 Timothy and in Titus 1 refer to a person's present life and present character. The Bible does not prohibit someone who has been married before from holding office or being a pastor, but it does require that the person be faithful to their spouse and remain in a committed union relationship. If a person has had a divorce in their life prior to their salvation, this should not be used against them. If a person has had a divorce during their Christian walk, and it was for a reason that has been mentioned in this teaching, it should not be used against them. Brothers and sisters, if you have something in your past that is consistent with what has been taught in this teaching, God can still use you. In other words, if something beyond your control occurred in your life and ended your marriage, take heart. God can still use you in a mighty way. The only one who is limiting yourself is you in your overthinking. Like for me, in my overthinking, in my self-condemnation. Further, if your marriage ended previously and you have lived a strong, healthy Christian walk for some time and feel the call to pastoral ministry, nothing should keep you from fulfilling that call. If you're in your 50s or 60s and you feel God leading you into pastoral ministry and you got a divorce in your 30s or in your 40s, nothing should permit you or keep you from fulfilling that call. Now, if you got a divorce 6 months ago, I think perhaps you should take some time and heal. I want to be very clear that in order to serve in pastoral ministry, I think you need to be a healthy and mature Christian. Therefore, you need to be healed from the hurts that have infiltrated your life, regardless of what they may be. If they are divorce or interrelational, whether or not divorce occurred at all, it could be a relationship. Maybe you got broken up with and you are very, very hurt. You need to heal from those things prior to seeking out pastoral ministry or leadership. But regardless, do not allow overthinking to keep you on the sidelines, because that is precisely what I believe Satan desires. It is clear from Scripture that God desires for reconciliation to occur if possible. In other words, if the marriage can be saved, it should be. If the marriage can be saved, that should be fought for. In my marriage, I tried for 4.5 to 5 years to do that. If the marriage can be saved, it should be. These options should be exhausted before divorce is ever thought about. The design of God is to use man who has been corrupted by the effects of sin in every aspect of their life. But nonetheless, we have been reconciled to God by the grace of God through faith. And we've been reconciled to him to accomplish his purposes on the earth. He wants to use you. The message is more about restoration in this teaching than it is for ruin. Just because you have had something in your life doesn't mean that you have been ruined from use by God, but it is a glorious message that God seeks to restore you in right relationship with Him to accomplish His purposes in the world. Yes, I believe what Satan meant for ruin, God will restore and use to accomplish His purposes. I hope this teaching has been a blessing to you, as it was a blessing for me to prepare it and to deliver it. Patrick, you have been very, very quiet, and I know this has kind of gone over time as it is, but is there anything that you would like to add to the discussion? Yeah, you're on mute. There you go.
So first of all, let me say I appreciate everything that you've brought up and discussed here. I know it takes a lot to share parts of your testimony, and I think I appreciate it. Your audience will appreciate it. There's a lot of good things here. I found myself probably taking notes more than asking questions or writing down questions. So that's good because I have always had the belief of somewhat the Southern Baptist culture about marriage and remarriage and what that can look like. Over time, I have begun to see how people are affected by like long-term marriages. We've had family members, for instance, that were perhaps in a marriage when they should have no longer been in the marriage, right?
Yep.
And things that happened with them that they felt like it would have been slanderous, in God's eyes and in the church's eyes if they would have gotten divorced, so they were committed to each other through death, and a lot of that is what I've seen through what John Piper has said. I was trying to locate some articles while you were speaking about why or if the context of remarriage comes up, and what Piper truly means about that. I was looking through he has a show, I guess, called Ask Pastor John that he's done
Yep.
now for several years, and most of it is just in the context of either it's all about trying to salvage the marriage, like you were saying before. Like y'all don't disagree on that premise.
Right.
Um, that you should do anything you can to salvage the marriage, no matter what. He even goes as far as to say if you get married out of step with God, that it can still be rectified, repented of. That marriage itself is a good thing.
Yep.
Um, and I thought that was very interesting. Um, and so a couple of things I wanted to bring up here is we talked about what disqualifies you, what could disqualify you for ministry, what people say versus what the scripture says. I wanted to ask because some people they'll say to me that I've heard from a divorced person. I haven't even been married myself yet, right? So I'm speaking of this from someone who's not been in that boat. But they'll say things like, "Well, nothing really wrong with the marriage. We just grew apart over time, like people change over time, and therefore it led to a separation, and they couldn't come back from where they once were in their 20s, let's say." And so, a question I have um, is that something that could be still God ordained, you think, or is that them, kind of moving away from what God designed through the course of marriage?
Yeah. I think it tends to that type of excuse, I think, for marriage, and I think it is kind of an excuse, I think is more or less them moving away from the central purpose of what God has called them to do in marriage, right? If you are an individual who values your wife like above every other relationship, and you're a wife who values your husband over every other relationship, and you do that consistently, then it's not as if you're just going to wake up one day and be like, oh my gosh, we're so different. We don't like each other anymore.
Mm,
It's one of those things that if you are consistent about loving your spouse and treasuring your spouse, and that does mean doing a lot of uncomfortable things with in terms of making sure that your spouse knows that they are the most valued and treasured relationship in your life. In other words, like if you want to watch the football game, but they have a party that they want to do with their couple friends or whatever, people from church or whatever it may be,
right.
instead of doing what you want, sometimes maybe you have to adhere to what they want from time to time, and vice versa, right? It just goes to show what you put your effort in and your time in, that will be visibly your treasure. So what you spend your money on, what you spend your time doing, that will be, obviously, it will show people in the world what your treasure is. And we make a case for that in terms of, God should be your treasure, so we should see it. But same could be said about your spouse.
Mm,
If you don't spend time with your spouse and you don't cultivate the relationship, and you don't at times spend money on them, just make them, give them something this special, something that's something that they will value and treasure, like a gift or something for Christmas or their birthday or Valentine's Day or what have you. Then eventually there's going to be resentment that builds up, and it will that's when the excuse will come up, well, we've just simply grown apart. No, it's not that you've grown apart, it's just that either one or both have stopped putting effort in.
mm. Yeah, and another one that I brought up is this idea of, you talk about church leaders, and I wanted to make clear, does that also encompass like any type of Sunday school teacher, small group leader, the minutia of the church? Because I've seen people that they'll be going through marital problems or going through a divorce, and then they'll be teaching a class on it, kind of thing. So what is that? How do you see that in the fold of church leadership?
I think it's all inclusive. So if you are, it doesn't matter what you're doing in the church. If you're a leader in the church, and certainly leading a small group or a Bible study is a leader in the church, because you are teaching the Word of God. You're charged with teaching the Word of God. So at the very least, your spiritual giftedness should include teaching, which is similar to that of pastoral leadership. While there isn't a specific criteria for those, unless you're a deacon or a pastor within the Bible, I think that some of the qualifications, or the applicability of those qualifications, could and should fall to ministry leadership and to church leadership and to roles like a Bible study leader or a small group leader. And that's why I try to say ministry leader. That's why I try to use that terminology, because I do think it could be all inclusive and more, and used for more, applied to other roles than just simply a pastor or an elder as it has traditionally been interpreted.
All right. And you also touched on this idea of physical abuse, and I think you even mentioned the mental side of it as well. But I wanted to ask you about that, like, because there's a whole culture that's brewing up now about mental culture. I mean, mental abuse and what that means. Mental abuse inside the church, is taking on several different forms now. Um, so, does that also qualify for abuse of a spouse in that context?
Yeah, so it could. It's always going to depend upon the severity, right? And it's always going to depend on whether or not what is occurring, the verbal abuse, the mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Obviously, the physical and sexual are probably going to be more severe because it does manifest itself in physical abuse. But the mental abuse and the verbal abuse can be applicable if it's severe enough, if it rises to that level of severity. Now, just simply something in such saying as such, I don't agree with you, or disagreement, of course not. Of course, it's not going to rise to that level. But if it's a repeated, like degrading, if the husband is repeatedly degrading the wife and just dogging the wife and just talking about how she's useless and blah, 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 then that could rise to that, particularly over time. If that is a consistent measure over time, then of course I think it could rise to fall under that in such cases clause in First Corinthians chapter 7 verse 15. Same thing with mental or emotional stability or whatever, because again, it all comes back to this idea that the godly design, the divine design for marriage, is for the husband to love the wife as Christ loved the church, and for the wife to love the husband as the church loves Christ.
Hmm.
And if anything like makes that impossible, then it could very well be one of those cases that fall under that particular clause. So
All right, and then I have one kind of uh, specific question, but it's also um, it's talking about also what I just talked about with abuse, but relations. You use a term, I think it was from Rain Grudem, right? Relationship cruelty. I don't know if that came from you or for Grudem, but uh, you also brought up danger for spouse to return, and that women are employed to stay with their husbands. And I know we probably each have several examples of this, but um, just lay out some more specifics on what maybe Grudem or you have seen about, these people being, in essence stuck in a relationship because they feel like that's what God wants them to do. And in essence, I think you were getting to the point of for a truly biblical relationship that that's not the healthy way to go.
yeah, no, certainly that specific term was definitely by Grudem. It wasn't mine. I'm not going to take credit for that. That was Grudem. But I will say that, like you said, like we have several examples that we could use. Obviously, the Southern Baptist Convention has several examples that they can turn to, unfortunately. And it's not just them. It's not just them. It's a lot of different types of evangelical churches and Protestant churches that are out there. But it is one of those situations in which if a spouse, it can be a husband, it can be a wife. Usually it's going to be the husband that is abusing the wife and making it an unsafe scenario for them, but it could be the other way around too. It could be the wife abusing the husband, making it an unsafe scenario. But if it's not safe for you to be in your home, then by all means, you need to leave. Go to a safe place, and there is no requirement to continue or maintain that type of relationship. It doesn't matter if that person professes to know Christ or not. It doesn't matter if that person has a church leadership position, which is one of the examples that I can think of right off the top of my head, where the guy was a pastor but was physically abusive to the spouse up to the point where it killed like an unborn child that was inside
Mm.
the mother. That was in the news not too long ago. Like I think it was like a year ago now, actually. But nonetheless, in that scenario, like the wife was pressured not only by her own convictions, but by her family, by his family, by the church, pressured by everybody to stay in the marriage because that's what God wants you to do. And my main advocation is no, that's not at all what God wants you to do. I see no evidence of that in scripture that God wants you to stay in an abusive relationship. If that was a dating relationship, we would advise those who were dating and being abused in that dating relationship to run. And I think that same advice should be applicable if you're married. If you are not in a safe environment, leave and go
Mm.
to a safe environment and save your own life, save the life of your children, because you're not doing yourself any favors or your children any favors. You're not doing anything for the glory of God, staying in an abusive relationship like that risk your life. Now, again, the aim is always going to be to reconcile. If there's reconciliation that can take place, or if the marriage can be saved, that's what the desire should be, and that's what we want to occur. But if abuse is taking place, then reconciliation is impossible. If physical violence is taking place, or threats of physical, if someone is saying that if you come back to this house, I'm going to kill you, don't go back to the house. Like, don't place yourself in that scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that we made those points very, very clear, and made sure that people can see in the Bible, not just our opinions, but in the Bible where that is being said and that is prevalent. That God is not designing marriage for you to stay in an abusive environment or an abusive situation. And so, Patrick,
Right.
I think we've covered a lot of the topics that we aimed at covering. I think it's probably time to wrap it up at this point, because um, we could probably split this one up into two as well, and so
Mm-hmm.
have part three. But this has been a great discussion. Is there any other points that you would like to add, before we close it out?
I mean, I do have one more dealing with Piper, if we have time. Um, so he mentions this idea that I was doing my research on. Um, he mentions this idea of not necessarily, never getting remarried, but you have to wait until the spouse effectively
Guys?
dies. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I've heard that in growing up in the Southern Baptist culture as well. They said that you make that covenant with someone in marriage, and so you basically have to wait until she dies. And I thought that your point too was prevalent. I think you're making the point too that you continually like enslaving yourself,
Yeah.
by
And I
doing
think
that. Is that the right thing?
Yeah, and I think Paul makes it pretty clear that if you're in a scenario like that, that you're no longer enslaved. Don't be enslaved to the other person. Paul makes that very, very clear. And I think Piper takes a very narrow view on just Luke chapter 16, that one verse in Luke chapter 16. He makes his entire case essentially on what is found there. And I think, and he does make some allusions to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, but he just takes he doesn't really deal with the enslaving part really at all. And so I think that's a weakness in his argument. And I think that Paul, just from the text, does make it clear that if a spouse leaves and deserts, or for the other reasons that would fall in that in such cases category that we talked about, in those scenarios where you're not an offensive party, not a sinning party, then you're no longer enslaved to that spouse. And I think that is the teaching that is consistent with Jesus's earthly ministry and the message of the gospel, that we are reconciled to him through love, through grace, through our faith, and that we are
Hmm.
not enslaved to our former selves.
Yeah, yeah, and he makes the point too that it's basically, um, like since you didn't do the divorcing, that you're still committed, as Christ was committed to the church, basically, or the church committed to Christ, and so doing that would be like some kind of abandonment yourself. But
Yeah, and I
you
think that's a very weak argument, and I think it disregards some of the central messaging of the gospel. If the message of the gospel applies to sinners, it's certainly going to apply to a non-sinning party in the confines of a marriage. So,
Mhm.
at that point, or at this point, I think we're going to close it out. This has been the what is this, sixth or seventh episode of the
Seven, I believe.
Theology Brothers podcast. It's part two of our discussion on marriage, biblical marriage, and what the Bible has to say about divorce. We hope you have found it helpful and have been blessed through the teaching and through the discussion, as we have been blessed through providing it and through studying for it. And our prayer for you is that everyone who is listening to this and everyone who is watching this has a godly marriage, a marriage that is blessed by God, and a marriage that is centered upon what God has done for us on the cross.